You are inside it. You always have been. It moves around you, carries heat, carries pressure, carries everything that passes through it. You don't need to hold anything in place. You don't need to follow where it goes. It continues without you. Citizen, you have reached the rest cycle. Tonight's archive concerns the atmosphere of old Earth, a continuous field of air moving in slow layers around the surface, carrying heat, pressure, and light. There is no need to follow its movement. It continues without instruction. It adjusts without effort. You are already within it. You have always been within it. Nothing needs to be held in place. The archive will carry the process. Rest now. You are breathing now. Not as an act, not as something you decided. The breath began before awareness arrived and will continue after attention moves elsewhere. The body knows what to do with air. It has known for so long that the knowing is not knowledge but structure, built into the rhythm of the chest, the chemistry of the blood, the mechanism that runs below any conscious participation. The air moves in. There is oxygen in it, a little over 1 part in 5. The rest is nitrogen and trace gases and water vapor that varies with the humidity and the season and whether the air has recently been above an ocean or a continent. The oxygen is what the body is oriented toward. The rest arrives with it, accepted, unremarked, already there. The air moves out, warmer now than when it arrived. The body has added heat to it. The heat of the metabolic processes, the heat of the blood in the capillaries of the lungs, the heat of the biological work that the oxygen supported. More carbon dioxide now, too, the exhaled signature of cellular respiration, the body's side of the exchange. This is not a detail. This is the whole shape of it. Every breath was an exchange with a planetary system. The oxygen arrived from the atmosphere, where it had accumulated over billions of years of photosynthesis, the slow, continuous output of organisms using sunlight to split water and release oxygen as a byproduct. The oxygen you breathed was made by life, released into the atmosphere, held there by the planet's gravity, and eventually drawn into your lungs. You took it in. You gave back carbon dioxide. The organisms of the surface took the carbon dioxide and returned oxygen. The cycle was continuous. You were in it. Breath is participation, not a transaction with an external system. A moment of connection with a cycle that had been running since before the first animal drew a breath. You participated in it without choosing to, without effort, without awareness of the scale of what you were participating in. The atmosphere above, the organisms around, the chemistry of the exchange, all of it continuous, all of it larger than any individual breath, all of it dependent on the accumulation of billions of individual breaths across the entire history of life on the surface. You were not separate from the planetary atmosphere. You were one of its participants. Every breath changed it slightly, and it sustained every breath. Not in a way that any single breath could measure. In the aggregate, across all the life on the surface, continuously. The exchange was the system was the condition was always there. You were always inside it. Air is a substance. This seems obvious, but the body treats it as absence, as the space that exists when everything else has been removed, as the background condition present when nothing else is. Air is not background. It is material. It has mass and density and viscosity. It behaves as a fluid because it is a fluid, one that is invisible and moves fast enough that the eye reads it as nothing rather than something. The body knows better. Run your hand through the air quickly and the resistance is there. The air pushed aside, the slight turbulence behind the moving hand, the temperature change as motion carries heat from the skin. The hand leaves a brief disturbance in the fluid it passed through. The disturbance closes behind it. The air returns to where it was. Sound moves through air. This is not trivial. Sound is a pressure wave, a compression moving outward through a medium at a rate the medium's properties determine. In air at sea level and ordinary temperature, this is approximately 340 meters per second. Every sound you ever heard traveled to you through the air. The first voice, the music, the rain on a window, the distant storm. The medium carried all of it. The medium was so continuous, so constant, so perfectly suited to carrying sound that sound seemed to travel on its own, as if the air were transparent to it rather than the active carrier of it. Remove the medium and there is silence. Not the silence of a quiet room, where the air carries no sound because nothing is producing any. Absolute silence. The silence of space, where there is no medium, where the vibration of any event propagates to nothing because there is nothing to propagate through. The sounds of old Earth, all of them, every conversation and storm and birdsong and ocean wave, were sounds because the atmosphere was there to carry them. Without the atmosphere, there would have been nothing to hear. Not quiet. Nothing. Scent moves through air too. The molecules of a flower, of bread, of rain approaching, all of them suspended in the air, borne toward the nose by the movement of the medium, dissolved there into the chemical detection of the olfactory system. Everything you ever smelled was something the atmosphere delivered to you. Every scent was a message from a source, carried through the medium, received in the body as a form of knowledge, where the food is, where the rain is coming from, what is nearby in the dark. Warmth moves through air. The air holds heat, the warm air above a summer road, the cold air settling in a valley at night, the temperature of a room maintained by the exchange between body heat and the surrounding medium. The air was always in thermal relationship with everything inside it, taking heat from what was warm, giving heat to what was cold, moving the heat around as the air moved. The medium was everywhere. Everything that happened on the surface happened inside it. At sea level, the atmosphere pressed down on everything with a weight of approximately 1 kilogram per square centimeter of surface. This is what you carried, not occasionally, not when the weather changed or the altitude dropped, continuously from birth as the constant condition of existing at the surface of a planet with an atmosphere of this density and this mass. On the average adult human body, approximately 2 square meters of skin, this was the equivalent of roughly 20,000 kilograms pressing from above. The weight of what was above, pressing down, pressing in from every side simultaneously. You never felt it. Not because it was not there, because it was everywhere at once. The pressure from above was equal to the pressure from below, equal to the pressure from the sides. The body was built inside the atmosphere, built for the atmosphere's pressure, built with the interior biology calibrated to operate at exactly this pressure. The atmosphere pressed from every direction simultaneously, and the body pressed back from the inside simultaneously, and the result was equilibrium. Not the absence of pressure, but pressure so perfect and total that it could not be experienced as pressure. The pressure was the condition. The body does not feel the pressure of the atmosphere. For the same reason, a creature living at depth in the ocean does not feel the pressure of the water. Not because pressure is absent, but because the medium is everywhere. There is no boundary between pressured and unpressured to register as sensation. The pressure is the baseline from which all other pressures are measured. Climb a mountain, 2,000 meters, 3,000. The air becomes thinner, the pressure decreases. The body registers this as effort. The lungs work harder, the heart beats faster, the muscles tire more quickly at the same pace. The body that was built for sea level pressure begins to notice the difference when the pressure drops from what it expects. The headache at altitude, the breathing that does not feel complete, the effort required to do what was effortless below. Not because something has been added at altitude, because something has been reduced. The pressure at the surface was not neutral. It was not nothing. It was the precise condition the body was designed for. The condition that every biological process had been calibrated against over hundreds of millions of years of evolution at the surface of a planet with this atmosphere. The pressure supported the function of the lungs. The pressure was implicated in the movement of fluid through the body's systems. The pressure was the baseline. The pressure was always there, supporting the biological work, present before any awareness of it. The constant condition, invisible precisely because it was constant, present precisely because it was everywhere. Nothing alive stood outside it. High in the atmosphere, above most of the weather, above most of the clouds, at altitudes where the air was very thin but still present, a layer of ozone absorbed a specific portion of the radiation arriving from the sun. Ultraviolet radiation. The ozone layer absorbed most of it before it arrived. Not dramatically, not as a visible event, as a continuous structural process that had been operating since the ozone layer formed several 100 million years before any complex life evolved at the surface to benefit from it. The radiation entered the atmosphere. The ozone received it. What reached the surface had already passed through the filter. The filter was always operating. You never saw it. There was nothing to see. The sky above did not look different because the ozone was there. The light that reached you was simply the light the atmosphere had processed. You stood in it and were warm and were not damaged in the ways you would have been damaged without the filter. And you did not need to know the filter was there for the filter to function. Protection does not always announce itself. The atmosphere did this continuously, filtered, absorbed, redistributed, without producing any signal at the surface that the filtering was occurring. The stars were not dimmer for it, the warmth was not reduced, the light was not obviously changed. The condition of protection was simply present, operating, maintaining the surface that life depended on, as it had been operating since before the organisms whose DNA it was protecting had evolved. The filtering was not something done for life. It was something the atmosphere did because of its composition. Life did not request it. Life did not maintain it. Life evolved in the presence of it and became, over time, dependent on the conditions the filtering maintained. The protection was older than the life it protected. It was always there. Something else happened in the upper atmosphere. Continuously, invisibly, without any announcement at the surface. The atmosphere encountered space material, particles of rock and metal arriving from outside at great speed. They entered. The air received them. The material burned, rapidly, completely, in a trail of light visible from the surface against the dark sky. Most of this material never reached the ground. The atmosphere incinerated it at altitude. The particle that might otherwise have struck the surface was converted to vapor and dispersed before it arrived. The surface received the light of the burning, not the impact. This happened constantly. Hundreds of millions of kilograms of space material entered the atmosphere of old Earth each year. Most of it was small, particles of dust, grains of sand, occasional pebbles. Most of it burned completely in the upper atmosphere before it reached any altitude where anything breathed. The surface of the planet experienced this not as bombardment, but as the occasional light of a meteor, the brief, bright streak across a dark sky, visible for a second, then gone. What you saw was the atmosphere working. The light was the friction was the protection. The thing that burned was the thing that would otherwise have continued. And it arrived at you as something beautiful, a streak of light across the dark, something that made a person stop and look and sometimes make a wish, without any indication that what you were watching was a piece of space being converted into the medium you were breathing. You were watching the atmosphere protect you. You thought you were watching a falling star. This happened every night. On clear nights, the sky showed several quick streaks at the edge of vision, bright ones that left trails, occasional ones that lasted long enough to feel significant. And on specific nights each year, when the planet's orbit carried it through the debris fields of ancient comets, there were hundreds per hour, the sky full of brief lights, every one of them the atmosphere receiving something and burning it away before it reached the surface. The sky of meteors was the atmosphere at its most visible as protector. Not because the protection was greater on those nights, the protection was continuous, the same process every day and night of the year, but because the volume was higher and the trails were brighter and the sky made legible for a few hours in autumn what it was doing all year. You lay on your back and watched the light. You did not know you were watching the condition that held you, expressing itself as fire. It was never still. The protection was always in motion. The sky of old Earth was blue. Not because the atmosphere was blue, not because space was blue, because of something the atmosphere did with light, a specific optical effect produced by the interaction of sunlight with the molecules of air. Sunlight arrives as all the visible wavelengths together. When it entered the atmosphere and encountered the molecules of air, the different wavelengths scattered differently. Shorter wavelengths scattered more. Longer wavelengths passed more directly through. Blue is a short wavelength. The blue in sunlight scattered in every direction, distributed across the entire sky, arriving at the eye from every part of the atmosphere above. When you looked at the sky away from the sun, you were seeing the accumulated scatter of blue light, the blue that had been distributed across the entire volume of air above you. The sky was not blue. The sky was an effect of the specific composition of the atmosphere and the specific wavelengths of sunlight and the specific size of the molecules doing the scattering. A different atmosphere, different gases, different density, different molecular size would produce a different sky. The sky was the atmosphere expressing itself through light. When you looked up, you were looking at the atmosphere, though nothing you saw told you so. At sunset, the path the light traveled through the atmosphere became longer as the sun approached the horizon. The same atmosphere, but traversed at a shallow angle through more of its depth. By the time the light reached an observer at sunset, the blue had been scattered away by the longer path. What arrived was the red and orange, the wavelengths that scattered least, that traveled furthest without being distributed across the sky. The sunset was the atmosphere at maximum depth, expressing the full extent of what it did with light. The sky color was always a record of what the atmosphere was doing at that moment. The pale blue of a clear noon, the deep blue directly overhead, the white near the horizon where the atmosphere was thickest to look through, the orange and red of the last light, all of it the atmosphere, in the medium of light. The sky was an effect of what held you. You looked up and saw it every day. You were looking at the atmosphere. You were always looking at the atmosphere. You just did not have a word for what you were seeing that connected the color of the sky to the thing that was holding you. The sky was not above the atmosphere. There is no above the atmosphere from the surface. What you called the sky, the color, the clouds, the arc of it from horizon to horizon, was entirely inside the atmosphere. The blue overhead was the top of the weather layer, the region where the air was thin enough that the scattering of light produced the deepest color. You were at the bottom of a medium looking up through it. The sky you saw was the medium you were in, seen from below. Everything you thought of as sky was atmosphere. Every cloud was atmosphere, water vapor the atmosphere had carried from the ocean surface, lifted by the warming of the air, condensed at altitude. Every sunrise and sunset was atmosphere, the light refracted and scattered by the depth of it. Every aurora was atmosphere, the thin upper reaches interacting with the charged particles arriving from the sun, lighting up in the process. You were never looking at something outside the condition that held you. You were looking at the condition itself, lit from within. The atmosphere did not merely allow warmth, it stored it. The surface was warmer than it would otherwise be. Not by a small amount, the liquid water that covered most of the surface, the range of temperatures within which the chemistry of surface life operated, the conditions that made everything else possible, all of it downstream of the atmosphere holding the planet's heat. The warmth was not a product of the sun alone. The sun provided the energy. The atmosphere determined how much of it was retained. A planet at the same distance from the same star without an atmosphere would have been a cold surface. Too cold for liquid water, too cold for the chemistry that built the complexity of life on old Earth. The atmosphere was part of the heat budget of the surface. It was structural. The warmth you felt outdoors, the warmth of a summer afternoon, of a room with people in it, of a body next to you in the dark, all of it was possible because the atmosphere held what the sun sent within a range. The range was narrow enough to allow the chemistry of life. It was maintained not by anything living, but by the composition of the atmosphere, which had reached its particular state over billions of years of geological and biological activity. The atmosphere did not know it was maintaining the conditions for life. It was simply its composition. Its composition had particular thermal properties. Those properties retained heat. The retained heat maintained the surface at a temperature that the chemistry of life had evolved to require. This was not designed. It was the outcome of the system. The atmosphere, the sunlight, the surface, the orbit, all of them interacting with the result that life was possible. The warmth was always there, not as a gift, as a consequence. The planet, wrapped in its thin layer of thermally active gas, retained enough of what the sun sent to hold the surface in the narrow range of conditions it held. Weather was the atmosphere in motion. Not the atmosphere when it misbehaved, not the atmosphere exceeding its normal state. Weather was what the atmosphere did, the continuous redistribution of heat and moisture across the surface of the planet, driven by the same principle as the ocean's circulation, the uneven heating of the surface by the sun producing differences, and differences seeking to equalize, and the equalizing producing motion. The tropics received more heat than the poles. The ocean surface heated differently from the land. The atmosphere responded to all of it. Warm air rising where the surface was warmest, cool air descending where it was coldest, the constant lateral movement of air masses from higher pressure to lower pressure, carrying moisture from the ocean over the land, depositing it as rain, returning dry, cycling back. The circulation of the atmosphere was not like the ocean's thermohaline circulation, much faster, much more variable, producing changes on the scale of hours rather than centuries. But driven by the same logic, difference as engine, motion as consequence. The air was always moving. Even on a still day, a day with no perceptible wind, when the leaves did not stir and the surface of a pond was glassy, the air was moving at scales too small and too local to feel as wind. At the molecular scale, the constant collision and drift of particles. At the regional scale, the slow migration of air masses across hundreds of kilometers, invisible at any single point, but shaping the weather of the coming days. You were inside the motion, not the way a ship is inside a current. You did not feel the air moving as a force imposed on you, not unless it was moving fast enough to register as wind. You experienced the atmosphere's motion as the changing of the weather, the smell of rain before it arrived, the temperature drop as a front passed through, the sound of a storm building at the edge of hearing before the storm arrived. The atmosphere carried everything it moved through. Heat from the tropics toward the poles, cold air from the poles equatorward, moisture from the ocean surfaces over the continents, spores and seeds and pollen from plants that had evolved to use the atmospheric circulation as a transport system, dispersing their genetic material on the wind across distances no individual organism could travel. Everything in transit, everything arriving from somewhere, everything on its way to somewhere else. The air was moving. It is always moving. Carries. The atmosphere did not end. It thinned. The transition from atmosphere to space was not a wall or a surface or a sharp line. It was a gradient, the same kind of gradient that defined the edge of an ocean current or the boundary between two different bodies of air. The air became progressively thinner with altitude, with no absolute threshold, no moment at which it was definitively atmosphere on one side and definitively not atmosphere on the other. 100 kilometers up was a conventional boundary, the altitude above which the air was too thin for aerodynamic flight. But the atmosphere extended in diminishing density much farther than that. The gradients became very long before they became truly zero. Below 30 kilometers sat approximately 99% of the mass of the entire atmosphere. The stratosphere, the weather layer, the first layer of the ozone, the zone of flight, all of it, the clouds, the weather systems, the oxygen that living things breathed, the ozone that filtered the radiation, the blue that scattered into the sky, contained in the first 30 kilometers above the surface. If old Earth were an apple, the atmosphere would be thinner than the apple's skin. Not as metaphor for irrelevance, as a fact about the relationship between the planet and the layer of gas that surrounded it. The planet was enormous. The atmosphere, by the scale of the planet, was thin. A thin, fragile shell of gas held in place by the planet's gravity, thin enough that a journey of a few hundred kilometers straight up would take you above most of it. Thin enough that on the surface you were, in a sense, at the bottom of an ocean of gas so shallow it could be measured in the time it takes a fast aircraft to cross it vertically. And yet this skin was the condition. Everything that breathed was in the bottom of it. Every storm, every cloud, every organism that flew was in the first few kilometers. Every ocean current, every land surface, every grain of soil was below it. The entire history of life on the surface of the planet, every generation of every species that had ever existed, had lived and died in the bottom few kilometers of a gas layer thinner than the peel of a fruit relative to the fruit. This thin layer held the warmth, filtered the radiation, burned what arrived from space, carried the breath, protected the surface. From the outside, from space, you would barely see it. A thin haze at the horizon of the planet, a slight blue-white at the edge, visible only because of what it did with light. From the inside, you never needed to see it at all. It was simply there, as it always had been. The nitrogen in the atmosphere had been there for longer than life. The atoms themselves had been circulating since before there was any biology to circulate through. The nitrogen cycle moved them through the atmosphere, through the soil, through the bodies of living things and back. The same nitrogen, cycling. The oxygen was younger. Before life, the atmosphere of old Earth contained very little oxygen. The oxygen that was there when the surface became habitable for complex animal life, the proportion the body needed, had been produced by billions of years of photosynthesis, by organisms that use sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into organic compounds, releasing oxygen as a byproduct, by the cyanobacteria in the ancient ocean, which produced enough oxygen over enough time to change the composition of the entire atmosphere, by the algae and the plants that followed, all of them contributing over geological time to the slow accumulation of oxygen in the air. Not all of it arrived before life. Some of it was made by life. The oxygen was biological. Life had changed the composition of the atmosphere. The changed atmosphere made possible a different kind of life. That life further changed the atmosphere. And the result, over billions of years, was the composition that existed when complex animal life emerged. The right proportion of oxygen, the right filtering, the right thermal properties. It was already enough. You breathed the output of billions of years of photosynthesis. The oxygen that entered your lungs had already been somewhere. Before that, produced by photosynthetic organisms in the ocean or on land. Before that, somewhere in the carbon cycle. Before that, in the bodies of organisms that had used it and released carbon dioxide, which other organisms converted back into oxygen. The same atoms, cycling. The chain of exchange reached back to the origin of the atmosphere, and before that, to the origin of the planet. Every breath was a participation in that chain. Not as metaphor, as the actual chemistry. The same atoms, the same processes, the same exchange between life and atmosphere that had been running continuously since the atmosphere became what it was. You were one link in a chain of exchange that began before your species existed, that continued after any individual breath, that had no beginning in living memory. You were not separate from the planetary atmosphere. You were the planetary atmosphere, passing through a form. Nothing alive on old Earth was outside the atmosphere. This is not simply a statement about geography. It is a statement about what life on that planet was. Every organism, from the bacteria in the deepest ocean sediment to the birds at the highest recorded flight altitude, existed inside the atmospheric system, was shaped by it, depended on it, participated in it. The organisms at the surface breathed it directly. The organisms in the ocean breathed the oxygen dissolved in the water, which had dissolved from the atmosphere at the ocean's surface. The organisms in the soil depended on the chemistry of air as it moved through soil pores and dissolved in soil water. Even the organisms at the very bottom of the deep ocean trenches, at the greatest distances from the surface, were dependent on the oxygen that the thermohaline circulation brought down from the surface, oxygen that had originally come from the atmosphere. Nothing alive stood outside it. This should be understood as a definition, not merely an observation. Life on old Earth was the kind of life that existed inside an atmosphere. It was not adapted to the atmosphere in the way that a desert organism is adapted to dry conditions, as if life had once existed without atmosphere and then found ways to survive within one. Life on old Earth evolved inside the atmosphere from the beginning. The atmosphere was not an environment life moved into. The atmosphere was the condition life came from, the premises that allowed the first chemistry of life to occur, the liquid water, the temperatures, the chemical gradients. All of them were products of the atmospheric system. The difference matters. An adaptation is a solution to a problem. The atmosphere was not a problem life solved. The atmosphere was the premise. Life was one of its products and participants, shaped by it, dependent on it, maintaining it in the configuration that allowed it. Container and contained, condition and consequence. The same system both at once. The condition held. Nothing alive stood outside it. There was nothing outside it to stand in. Not in the sense of being trapped. Nothing about the atmosphere was a constraint on life. But in the sense that outside the atmosphere was a condition that no life on old Earth was built to occupy. The hard vacuum of space. No pressure to equalize against. No medium for sound. No oxygen. No thermal envelope. The conditions that make biological processes possible simply absent. Not hostile. There is nothing hostile about a vacuum. Indifferent. Simply not the premise that life on that planet was made from. The atmosphere was not a feature of the world life lived in. It was the world. Everything else, the land, the ocean, the sunlight, the seasons, existed inside it, was shaped by it, depended on its continued presence for its own continued existence. Remove the atmosphere and the ocean would begin to evaporate into space. The warmth would dissipate. The chemistry of the soil would change. The biological cycles would unravel in the order that they depended on the atmospheric conditions the atmosphere maintained. Not quickly, not all at once, but irreversibly. The atmosphere was not optional. It was the condition, the first condition, the condition that all other conditions depended on. You could not see the atmosphere. You could see through it, through the air, to the trees and the horizon and the sky. You could see the effects of it, the blue overhead, the sunset colors, the shimmer of heat rising from a summer road, the haze at great distances where the air itself became visible as a medium between the eye and the horizon. You could see the weather that moved through it. You could see the meteor in the night sky that was the atmosphere working. But the atmosphere itself, the gas, the invisible structure, the thing that held all of it, was not visible. This is a particular kind of thing to depend on completely. Most of what life depends on is in some sense perceptible. Water is visible, audible, tactile. Food has texture and smell and color. The sun is visible, bright, warm on the skin. The ground is solid underfoot. Other organisms, the ones that might help or harm, are perceptible. The atmosphere was not. It was the invisible medium in which all the visible things existed. The carrier of sound, so present that sound seemed to travel on its own. The holder of warmth, so continuous that warmth seemed simply there rather than maintained. The filter of radiation, operating without announcement, protecting without being seen to protect. The provider of the oxygen in every breath, arriving without color or texture or smell, as if it were nothing rather than the most immediate requirement of remaining alive. You move through life inside it without needing to be aware of it. This was not ignorance. It was the design of a system that works by being continuous. A system that operates without interruption does not require awareness. It is only when the continuous thing becomes discontinuous, when the air grows thin at altitude, when the composition changes, when the pressure drops unexpectedly, that the dependency becomes legible. Until then, the atmosphere is the background, the taken for granted, the always present. The sky was an effect of what held you. You looked up and saw the color the atmosphere made with light. You breathed and felt nothing unusual because the exchange was proceeding exactly as it always had. You stood in the warmth and did not notice that the warmth was maintained, not given, because the maintenance was perfect and continuous and never faltered. You were always inside it. Return now to the breath, the one that is happening right now, in the cryo chamber, in the different atmosphere of the ship. Not the same composition as old Earth, not the same pressure, not the product of billions of years of biological processing by the organisms of a specific planet, but air, a breathable medium, a maintained condition. The ship produces it, not the way the planet produced it, not over billions of years of photosynthesis, not as the accumulated output of trillions of organisms across geological time. The ship produces it mechanically, from stored reserves and recycled exhalation, in proportions calibrated to maintain the biology of the colonists through the voyage. The process is different, the scale is different, the origin is different. The logic is the same. A contained condition, a maintained composition, a volume of the right gases held in place not by gravity, but by the hull of the vessel, providing the pressure and the chemistry that the biological processes inside it require. The mechanism is different. The principle is the same. You are inside a maintained atmosphere on the planet. You are inside a maintained atmosphere now. The planet's atmosphere did not require your awareness to function. Neither does the ship's. You are held inside a condition that is maintaining the chemistry of your biology while you are not participating. The breath continues. The pressure is maintained. The composition is regulated. The biological processes that constitute you, the cellular respiration, the temperature maintenance, the chemistry of the blood, the slow work of the cells, are proceeding at the pace the conditions allow, in the medium the conditions provide. The atmosphere of the planet did this for all of your life before the voyage. You did not choose it, you did not maintain it, you did not need to understand it for it to work. You breathed, and the atmosphere gave you what you needed to breathe, and you breathed again, and the cycle was continuous, and you were inside it, and it never asked anything of you except that you participate in it by being alive. You participated, and the condition held. The condition is not the same. The logic is, rest in it. The archive record for atmospheric systems is now complete for for this transmission. The atmosphere of old Earth was not air above the planet. It was the continuous condition that made surface life possible, a thin layer of specific gases held in place by the planet's gravity, maintaining the pressure and the warmth and the chemical composition that the biology of the surface required. Filtering what would otherwise arrive unchanged, carrying what needed to be carried, burning what entered from space, scattering light into the colors the eye evolved to see, and holding the warmth the chemistry of life evolved to require. It was invisible. It was everywhere. Everything alive was inside it, always, from the first breath to the last. The sky was the atmosphere expressing itself through light. The warmth was the atmosphere holding the planet's heat. The breath was the atmosphere completing its cycle through the bodies of the organisms it sustained. The protection was always there. It did not announce itself. It simply held. This is what the atmosphere was, not a resource, not a feature, not something that existed for the convenience of the life inside it. A condition prior to life produced by the planet, maintained by the interaction of geology and biology and light and gravity over billions of years. A condition that the life inside it depended on completely and perceived barely at all. You breathed it, you heard through it, you were warm in it. You saw the colors it made with light and did not know you were seeing the atmosphere. You were protected by it continuously, and most of what it protected you from never entered your awareness. You lived inside a condition so complete it was invisible. Rest now. You are always inside it. You are inside it still. Sleep ship archive. Transmission complete. Vessel status stable. Cryosleep monitoring nominal. All systems nominal. Archive records sealed and filed. Voyage continues. Please continue restorative sleep.